me formally invite all of you to our Friday webinar series. At the outset, I must mention that the webinar series started with the COVID, and we have been very fortunate to have the best minds on contemporary issues to speak to us across the world. We have ourselves deliberately tried to have a blend of Indian speakers and foreign speakers. We are very fortunate to have professors from the elite universities across the world, Harvard, Chicago, Berkeley, and we have had two Nobel laureates also come and speak to us. All the discussions that we have held in the past are on contemporary issues which we thought would be useful for Indian policymakers. We have not only focused on economic issues, we have also in this journey focused on socio-economic issues. We have also focused on foreign relations and anything that would concern India's national security. It is in that very context that we requested Ambassador Shyam Saran to please come and speak to our audience because he's an expert. He has written so much on China to come and speak to us about China. While Russia-Ukraine war was on, the geopolitics that is changing so rapidly and the Cold War sort of a situation between China and America is becoming so apparent, and the fear that China would soon attack Taiwan, all those were the concerns when we requested Ambassador Saran to come and speak to us, and we are very fortunate he agreed. So today's seminar is on China, and we are also very fortunate that Dr. Arvind Virmani, who's member of Niti Aayog now, has agreed to chair the session. So let me introduce Dr. Virmani first, and then I'll introduce our main speaker, Ambassador Shyam Saran. Dr. Virmani actually is a well-known name in our country. He is now, of course, the member of the Niti Aayog, but earlier he has worked in various important places. He was the chief economic advisor of our country. He was the executive director representing India at the International Monetary Fund. He has worked at different places, especially in the World Bank, then at the Planning Commission, and then in the Ministry of Finance. He has also had a stint at EGROW. He has served as member Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. He has published extensively 35 journal articles, 20 book chapters, 50 other working papers in the areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reform, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. He is also well known for his two books, which I found them very interesting. One is From Unipolar to Multipolar World, and the other is Sudoku of India's Growth. His one research piece, which is little unknown, is on the reforms and going ahead in terms of reforms, which we at EGROW Foundation found out and we will be publishing it. I think the roadmap of India's reforms is contained in that book and we'll soon bring it to light and share with others. Let me now move on to introducing Ambassador Shyam Saran. Shyam Saran again is a very well-known name and needs no introduction in fact. He is a former Foreign Secretary of India, and we all used to know and read about him at that point of time, and has served as Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. After leaving government service in 2010, he has headed the RIS, a prestigious think tank focusing on economic issues, for nearly 6 years, and was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board under the National Security Council from 2013 to 2015. He is currently serving as president of India International Center, member of the governing board of the Center for Policy Research and the Institute of Chinese Studies. His first book, How India Sees the World, was published in 2017, he has recently published a second book, How China Sees India and the World. Ambassador Saran was awarded the Padma Bhushan, the third highest civilian award, in 2011 for his contributions to civil services. In May 2019, he was conferred the Spring Order Gold and Silver Star by the Emperor of Japan for promoting India Japan relations. With this, I hand over the session to Dr. Arvind Virmani to conduct the proceedings. Dr. Virmani, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to add two things which really, from my perspective, are very important. One is Ambassador Shyam Saran wrote a very kind of pioneering report on infrastructure, border infrastructure. With India-China border now in the news, we know about the infrastructure building, but he did the initial note and paper internal, which I think has played a very important role. And the other one, even before that, he had a big role in the India-US nuclear agreement, which really, I mean, nuclear agreement doesn't even capture that. We call it a civil nuclear agreement, but it basically opened the floodgates to India-US reform, which again are progressing, rapidly. But he laid the grounds for that. With that, Ambassador Shyam Saran, let me hand it to you.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani, and thank you, Dr. Charan Singh, for extending this very gracious invitation to me to speak at EGROW. Of course, I'm would like to take this opportunity of offering my felicitation to Dr. Virmani for having become a prestigious member of the Niti Aayog. And I have no doubt that in this new capacity, he will continue to contribute to economic policy making in India. So I thought I will peg my remarks on China to first talking about the recent party congress which was held. The 20th Party Congress. It met for about a week since October 16. And the decisions taken at the Congress, both with respect to leadership changes, or no change in the leadership, I should say, as well as the policy lines which were sketched out in the various Congress documents, I think it is worth looking at them because really they give a kind of a clue as to what we can expect in terms of Chinese economic policies going forward, but also Chinese foreign policy going forward. And in both these respects, these clues are important for also, influencing, in a sense, India's policy with regard to China. But not only China, but because China is the second largest economy of the world today. What happens in China has a major impact on the global economy. And if the global economy is impacted, then of course that impacts the international economic environment in which we have to operate. So it is worth looking at what those trends are with respect to the Congress and what they foretell in terms of the future. So since Xi Jinping became the senior most leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the president of China, this is in 2012. So he has been in power for 10 years. In these 10 years, essentially the kind of orientation, economic orientation, political orientation, which we were familiar with during the Deng Xiaoping era, the reform and economic liberalization program that he introduced in 1978 after the end of the Maoist era, the kind of, market-oriented policies that he inaugurated. He tried to reorient the role of the Chinese Communist Party towards more of a supervisory role rather than an active participant role. On the ideological side, what used to be a kind of a attachment to frugality, to very somber kind of lifestyle. What Tang Xiaoping did was to change that to a much more aspirational kind of economic policy. So this famous phrase that to get rich is glorious, which was like a complete anathema to what had gone on before, where frugality was the great value that was promoted. So during those Tang years, and even after Tang died, his successors, there were two or three very important changes which came about. As I said, as far as the party is concerned, it took on more of a supervisory role, but much more importantly, in order to avoid the kind of personality cult that the Maoist years were associated with, the kind of, very autocratic, very sort of, untrammeled power that Mao Zedong enjoyed, and which led to great disasters like the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine, and the Cultural Revolution in the country. In order to make certain that something like that did not happen, that you did not anymore have a leader with that kind of personality cult, with that kind of overweening authority, Tang Xiaoping introduced this aspect of that there should be limited terms for top leadership positions, 5 years plus 5 years, that there should be a informal maybe, but a kind of an age limit, not more than 67, 68 years for the top leaders. They should make way for the new generation. That there should be a smooth leadership transition. That when you are getting into your second term, 5-year term, that is the time when you should also identify actually who the successor is going to be, so that the leadership transitions are fairly smooth. And it should be fair to say that actually that particular norm has been observed until very recently. So, what are the political changes associated with Xi Jinping? One, the party has moved from being supervisory to being a very active participant in policy making and decision making. So what Xi Jinping has done is he has set up these commissions or party committees, which in fact are the senior most decision making bodies, which are in fact which enjoy greater authority than the ministries themselves or the agencies of the government themselves. So they function under the not only the supervision, but even in terms of the actual decisions taken, the party is supreme. So party has taken on now an executive role, very different from supervisory role. That is an important change that has taken place. Tang Xiaoping's reforms opened up space for private sector. And actually, much of the accelerated growth that has been experienced by China over a 40-year period from 1978 onwards, double-digit growth that China has been associated with, very large increase in exports, for example, investment. All these have been very much associated with the opening up of spaces for the private sector. And the success of this particular reform has been reflected in the fact that there are, big multinational Chinese companies like Alibaba, for example, Baidu, Weibo. All these are really the outcome of that kind of almost a freewheeling market system which was established by the reforms brought in by Deng Xiaoping. So the period of very rapid growth has been associated with the opening up of space for the private sector. And the private sector was given considerable amount of autonomy in terms of running its affairs. What has changed now is that even in the private sector companies, by the way, even in joint venture companies with foreign companies, party committees have been set up, and the party has a role to play, active role to play in the board of directors in terms of decisions which are taken with regard to that enterprise. So the party's presence has become quite pervasive. Its authority extends even over, the private sector. So the phase where the party, in a sense, was retiring from active intervention in society, active intervention in economic activities, particularly of private sector, that has changed. So even in respect of society, where the party did not really interfere in where you lived, whom you married, your entertainment activities were quite open. Generally speaking, compared to the past, it was a much more liberal kind of a social atmosphere which was flourishing. Video games, for example, or movies, or amusement parks. All these were activities which actually sorry, give me which actually made China, for people like us who had lived in China in the early years, Maoist years. I was there from 1974 to 77 during the Cultural Revolution itself. For me, this was a massive change. So people were actually able to have a private life. They could, as I said, decide where to live, whom to marry, where to work, go abroad, for if not for studying, for even tourism. You have seen large numbers of Chinese tourists before the pandemic visiting so many countries around the world. A much more liberal kind of an atmosphere prevailed. That also has started changing. So there is greater intervention by the state in the private lives of Chinese citizens in a manner that was not the case, in the last 20, 30 years. It has not quite completely been reversed, but certainly the party has taken on the role of determining what should be some social norms, also in terms of morality, what kind of behavior is expected from citizens. There is even a social credit system that if you misbehave, you get negative points, which may determine how the state treats you in the future. So this is a very important change which has taken place. Now, even though in 2012 it was in the party documents, if you see at that time, it is still stated that the main sort of determinant of economic activity should be the market. So the market should be the decisive factor in economic decision making. That was 2012. It was very much in line with what I mentioned as the economic reform and liberalization which prevailed before. Now you see that market orientation has in fact been very much modified. So private sector, which was given a much greater role, today what you see from the party documents, that it is the state-owned enterprises which will be the main force for the economic transformation of the Chinese economy. So the champions for the future of economic transformation will be state-owned enterprises. Secondly, Xi Jinping has attached great importance to the technological transformation of China. Much more in focus on things like the digital economy, on IT, on artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, biologic sciences, a whole series of the cutting edge technologies, the new age technologies. What we find is a focus on these as the instruments for bringing about a transformation of China. And even with respect to foreign policy, Xi Jinping has said that the battlefields of the future will be the battlefields of technology. So this is where what the determinant of a country's power will increasingly be with respect to its mastery of technology. And in terms of that mastery of technology, in terms of development of those sectors, the key role will be played not by the private sector, but the key role will be played by the state-owned enterprises, which will be the recipient of large amount of resources from the state. And now this has been particularly in a sense reinforced by the American decision, to prevent any kind of semiconductor technology, particularly at the higher end, from being accessed by China. Particularly the machines which make semiconductors, the design aspects, which are the most critical, those will no longer be allowed to be transferred to China. So therefore, he has stressed also that the one of the most important tasks before the Chinese party, the country, will be how to bring about technological self-reliance going forward. Because the kind of more benign international environment where China had over the last 40 years, where it was able to access both capital as well as technology from Western countries and other countries, that phase China recognizes is over. So it is going to be faced with a much more challenging environment, and therefore technological self-reliance is going to be the key objective going forward. So this comes out very clearly from the 20th Party Congress. There is also, I would like to just go back a little to some of the kind of important changes that have taken place in terms of economic strategy. So one is, as I mentioned to you, the market is not going to be as important a determinant as it used to be before. State-owned enterprises are going to play a greater role than before. But also what is very important is, whereas earlier it was accepted that, we should create an environment where market forces determine the allocation of resources. That should be the way forward. Planning was retained, but planning had less of a role to play than, for example, in the past. Now what is being said is very interesting. What is being said now is that market is important, but what is more important than that is what they call top level design. So that means, with respect to how the economy is structured, what are the ways in which you develop different dimensions of the economy, that should be subject not to the market, but should be subject to a top-down design or a top-down strategy that should be adopted. So this is another important shift that has taken place. Linked to that is the recognition that China is now facing huge economic and income inequalities. That 40-year period of accelerated growth has also led to very significant economic inequalities in the country, and that this is incompatible with the notion of a socialist country. So this comes out again very clearly in the speech that Xi Jinping made, and also in the documents, that the state now must intervene in order to address this inequality of income and wealth. How do you intend to do that? How you intend to do that is what Xi Jinping says, that we should be aiming for. We have currently a kind of a pyramid with regard to wealth and income. What this must be changed to is an olive-shaped, structure in terms of income and wealth. That is, the middle should be expanded, and at the top, fewer very wealthy people, and at the bottom, very few poor people as well. So there should be a conscious effort made by China to address these inequalities by aiming for a olive structured economy. So that's also very evocative in a sense as to what the objective is. But the contradiction here is that the easiest way, of course, to bring this about is to allow wages to rise. But that is not something that is very apparent. Secondly, you should spend a lot more money on social security in terms of the state providing, services for education, for health. While some reference has been made to greater investment in these social services in the Congress, but if we see the actual allocations in various budgets, in fact, very limited amount of money is provided for that. And as I mentioned, there is no stomach for actually increasing the wages, which would affect, of course, the competitiveness of the economy. So there is a certain contradiction that they have not been able to quite resolve. The intention is there, but the right kind of policies required for that is not there. The other aspect of this reducing inequality is, of course, how to treat the property sector. And I will end with that, because the property sector traditionally has been the biggest driver of Chinese economic growth. It has accounted for something like 30% of the Chinese economy. And it's not only real estate, but everything which is linked to it, cement, steel, glass, all the things, fittings, etc., which go into a residence. All those things are linked to the real estate sector. Now, the real estate sector is important in China for two reasons. One, the continually increasing prices and expectation of increasing prices has been a very important form of saving for much of the Chinese middle class, because they can own property unlike before. And because the property prices keep increasing, much of the wealth, personal wealth of Chinese is in fact kept in the form of real estate. So, because the returns from deposits in banks is very low, the returns from the stock market is very unpredictable and volatile. So over the last several years, because there has been a general expectation and reality has borne this out of steadily increasing real estate prices, this has been a very strong, in a sense, source of saving and accumulation of wealth for the middle class. So it should come as no surprise that this has also been a sector where there has been a lot of speculative buying and selling. Now, what has happened is that Xi Jinping, in terms of addressing the income and wealth inequality, in trying to bring about a more kind of a egalitarian society, also made the slogan, "Houses are for living, not for speculation." So the kind of money which was flowing into the real estate sector through bank loans, much of the construction, for example, of residential housing was done through, pre-sales. That is, you gave the money to the developer upfront for investing in the building of the residential property, and at a certain date you would get your property, you would get your flat or residence. And this was like a rolling thing, they kept on taking money, giving residences to people, but then borrowing even further, even more for the future. Now, this speculative bubble has burst. I mean, about a couple of years ago. And this has become a huge drag on the Chinese economy. And it has also had a very dampening effect on consumption, because if people are now feeling that they can no longer enjoy appreciation of their real estate, property, then that also affects their willingness and confidence in terms of consumption. So consumption in China is either flat or even declining. So this is the reason why Chinese growth rates have now come down quite significantly. This year, it is likely to be only about 3% or 3.5% per annum. And most analysts expect that the days of high growth rates of the Chinese economy are now belong to the past. That going forward, one cannot see China being able to revert to the higher growth rates of the past. And of course, most maturing economies, as you would, Dr. Virmani himself would testify, I'm sure, that most mature economies, the long-term secular trend is towards a growth rate of about 2% or 2.5% per annum. And I think China's long-term trend is also moving in that direction. So I think we will see progressively a slowing down of the Chinese economy. So let me conclude by pointing out, one, that we see a more ideological shift as far as Chinese politics is concerned, greater effort to assert the supremacy of the Communist Party of China. There is also a ideological turn in terms of going back to socialist values, including some degree of egalitarianism. Also, the shift of emphasis from the private sector to the state sector, state-owned enterprises, that also is very apparent, particularly with respect to what Xi Jinping sees as the challenge on the technology frontier. This is to be led not by private sector, as for example in the United States or in China itself in the past. It is going to be led by large state-owned enterprises. This is something which is quite apparent. And much of what will determine economic policy for the future will be a top-down kind of a decision-making structure. No longer so much reliance on the market as in the past. So with regard to China's foreign policy, obviously, these are factors which are going to impact on foreign policy as well. And I think if you see, for example, what has happened at the G20 and what is happening today at the APEC meeting, which is taking place, I think you will see some of these kind of manifestations of this new shift in China's policy from the party congress. So let me stop here, and then maybe we can take up some of these issues in the quick Q&A. I think you are muted, Dr. Virmani.
Sorry, yeah. Ambassador Saran has put it very nicely and differently. So let me summarize, because I've been listening to a lot of talk about after the Congress, but I think he has put it very nicely in terms of the political administrative changes and implication, the economic implications, and the social implications. And then finally, which I think is leading to questions, that what will be the impact on foreign policy. So we'll come back to that. So very briefly, let me just add a little bit on the economic side, because that's my subject, and then raise a couple of questions, and then I'll ask Charan to put his Charan and Professor Vishandas. So very briefly, I don't want to shift the focus to economy, but the two things which have been happening since 2008, which have been very clear, is that the ratio of property to GDP in China was much higher than other countries at its income level in the past or present. So that thing has been there from 2008. And the second aspect, which was even more noticeable, was the debt GDP ratio and how it kept rising. So we have been analyzing since I was at the IMF in terms of these debt bubbles. They would inflate the economy, then it was going out of hand, they would stop it. So there were continuous bubbles. And in fact, at the IMF, what I had predicted was that the time between bubbles or credit injections would become smaller and smaller because they'll become less and less effective. So this we've kind of come to the end of that road. So as an economist who's worked on debt, one could see that coming, but perhaps Xi Jinping's actions have accelerated and probably made it worse than perhaps it could have been, and could have perhaps been handled better in a different environment. The second point I would make is the the GDP growth. Again, in some sense, because I've followed China economy for a long time, one has been, and knowing the global way growth comes down gradually over as the economy gets, from lower income to lower middle, etc. We have seen this pattern everywhere. The surprise in China was for 30 years, it was growing at more or less the same rate, about average of 10%. But after that, one had predicted that it'll gradually slow to 8%, 6.5, 5.5, and 4.5. But again, perhaps the decline in the last 4-5 years is related to this change which Ambassador Saran is talking about the sun. So that's just a little addition to the economic part. Two questions, and finally, a little bit, because you haven't mentioned it, COVID zero is actually playing an important part. Of course, the dynamics is the debt dynamics, but the COVID zero has clearly one of those policies which is contributing to a faster disruption instead of a recovery or a soft landing, one might call it. Two questions, things you missed, or perhaps you don't think they are that important, but let me just mention them. One is the allegation, which is now increasingly coming not just from the US, from Canada, from UK, Australia, about past technology theft. It doesn't seem to be just a recent thing. It's been going on for 10, 20 years. Of course, one has been suspicious about this, but now they are alleging theft of all kinds of whole range of things. So just your comments on, some people have said this has played an important role in their technological development and also even the economic development. So if you want to say something on that aspect. Secondly, the anti-corruption policy. Clearly, the way it appeared in the beginning was actually a genuine anti-corruption policy, but increasingly it has seemed that it's become more a tool of political filling political objectives. So you might want to say a little bit on that. And of course, the foreign policy, I think all of us will take up. I won't say, the implications for India and for other countries, that perhaps you can come back to that. Please go ahead. If you want to say something on this, then I'll open it for others' questions.
Yeah, so you are quite right.
I could hear you.
I think we have.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, but I can't see you.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. So okay now. Yeah. So let me just respond to some of the comments you made. Yes, I did not talk about the impact of these COVID-19 lockdowns, which have had a very disruptive effect on economic activity across the board. I mean, the disruptions of supply chains and also China's foreign trade. This is why there have been some successive changes in the policy. One is what they call dynamic COVID policy, which is that it should not be, sort of across the board kind of lockdowns, but it should be much more targeted to various localities and various districts. And the second have been some guidelines which have been recently issued with regard to these restrictions, which are also aimed at opening up further, precisely because of those economic impacts. So these disruptions certainly are there, because of the COVID-19 lockdowns. But at the same time, I think some of the policy directions that I mentioned are more of a continuing nature. The COVID-19 restrictions, one can perhaps look at as being more temporary measures, more tactical measures, but I was more interested in looking at the strategic side. What does it mean in terms of future trends? The other aspect which you talked about, which is the allegation of technology theft. Yes, some theft is obviously taking place. But, if we look at economic history, every time there is a new emerging economic power, it does beg, borrow, or steal from some of the existing economic powers. I mean, the United States did with Europe and the UK during its own, economic development phase. And this has been also the case, say, of Japan, borrowing very heavily from the technology from the US. And I recall that even with regard to Japan, there used to be American allegations that American technology is being stolen by Japan and being commercialized. So that element may certainly be there. Perhaps it is on a greater scale than before. But my own experience has been that during the phase where much of these Western companies, Japanese companies, and Southeast Asian companies were looking at China as the great El Dorado, which, huge market, and they just had to be in China. During that phase, they were more than ready to share technology with China. Greed has been much more of a factor in terms of technology transfer to China than perhaps now the same companies are admitting to. Boeing, for example, made huge technology transfer to China during the time where China would say we'll buy 500 planes from you. But if we are going to buy 500 planes, this technology transfer has to take place. In fact, that played a far more important role. The economic interests that were involved, commercial interests that were involved in the transfer of technology. And I think what China has done is, if we see economic history as countries, emerging countries, first phase, you adopt technology from abroad. Second phase, you assimilate that technology. You learn from it. You try to develop your own capabilities on the basis of what you have learned. And you then finally get to a point where you are a generator of technology. You are a knowledge generator yourself. So you typically go through these three phases. Of course, these can be also parallel, but mostly there is this trajectory which countries follow. And you see that very clearly in China. China went through this phase of large scale adoption of technology from wherever it could get it. But unlike many other countries, including, I would say, India, it had an ecosystem in place in order to learn from their technology, to assimilate that technology. And in some areas, it would be fair to say that they are now getting to a point where they themselves are able to generate knowledge, they are able to generate technology. Certainly in some areas like say artificial intelligence, machine learning, they seem to be ahead even of the United States. That is a much more nuanced picture than what is perhaps suggested by these allegations. As far as the anti-corruption campaign is concerned, it was very popular because there was very widespread corruption. And I think what Xi Jinping tried to do was that he obtained tremendous amount of popular support by being seen as a crusader against corruption. This played a very important role in the consolidation of his political power. Now, was the element of political rivalry or factional struggle also mixed up with this? I would say it was mixed up with this right from the beginning. So it is not that only now it has shifted to the aspect of trying to get rid of political rivals. I think if you see the last party congress, in fact various people have been sidelined not on corruption charges. They have been just told you are no longer welcome. Even some of the most promising party leaders, because they did not belong to Xi Jinping's faction and to his network, they have been sidelined. Not necessarily on the pretext that they were corrupt. So I think he has consolidated power enough today to be able to not have to use the anti-corruption argument in order to consolidate his position. But it was certainly very important in the earlier phase of his leadership. So that
Right.
is what I would like to. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's a very valid comment. Yeah. So let me, yeah. Charan first, Dr. Vishan Das, then I think Major General Sudhakar, I think it is. We'll take him third. Yeah. Yeah.
Ambassador
Major
Saran,
General Sudhakar. Yeah.
Ambassador Saran, I must thank you, and of course, Dr. Virmani, both of you have added and enriched the discussion so far. I have myself been watching China for a long time, being a student of economics, and also then being both at Harvard and Stanford, where I interacted extensively with students and officials who would come to these places and also at the IMF. Now, one, I have two questions, Ambassador, and I'll be very brief. The first question is, how did China manage to do what Japan could not do? The Lauber record, which Americans used against the growth and development of Japan and asked the Europeans to join them. And Japan suffered one lost decade and the second lost decade and the third lost decade. But China, despite, as you said, stealing the technology or adopting the technology and then commercializing it, how did China, and I think there's a lesson for us there, how did China circumvent the American might and still made it the way it has made it? So is there a lesson for India in that? My second question, Ambassador, is moving forward. Dr. Virmani, of course, has written the book Unipolar to Multipolar World. But now I get a feeling that moving forward, the way the Chinese are strategizing themselves, and we do not know China as much, we know the Americans, of course. Moving forward, the geopolitical situation is shifting towards India right in its neighborhood. And my own feeling is China with $13 trillion economy, chasing a $20 trillion American economy, we with just about $3 trillion economy, way behind. China is going to go ahead leaps and bounds. Going ahead, the geopolitical center of gravity is next to us. How are we to prepare for it in days to come? Thank you, Ambassador.
A number of others have also asked about the implications for China. So China, these changes on India. So maybe you can take those together. Yeah.
Should I wait for a couple of other questions before answering, or should I answer?
Yeah, we can do that. Okay, we can add Vishan Das, Dr.
Maybe
Vishan.
a couple of other questions, and then I can answer.
Yeah, Dr. Vishan Das, you add, then we'll take Major General later. Yeah.
You're muted.
Thank you, Ambassador Shyam Saran. It was a stimulating and very masterful exposition. I have listened on couple of times you, and then you have broken your past records of being so precise and so lovely. It's a sheer delight always. My two questions: India is going to overtake in terms of population so far China is concerned. So how China themselves see their population policy of one child, then they took it, they relaxed. So last few years from mid 80s and now they are doing, but at the end of the round, in as per UNFPA, India is going to be the most populous country in the world. So how it will impact India's position vis-a-vis China in particular, that is one. And do they, according to you, are going to take some radical step on this, because the total fertility rate has come down? That is one. Second, after this new term of the current president, premier, uh, China is, as you said, is likely to be more aggressive. It is not more assertive, but more aggressive. So how they approach India and the Taiwan, because given that it has becoming are emerging more uh, 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 powerful, and I am also tempted to quote former foreign secretary Vijay Gokhale. He wrote in his one of the books, two books which he has written, that China is a grand deceptor, and how India would deal with it.
Okay, if you can take these, then we'll turn to General Saab.
Yeah. So the question of how China avoided what Japan could not. With regard to the for example, the Plaza Accord, I think the difference is that don't forget that Japan was a military ally of the United States. Therefore, as an ally, the United States, as the dominating ally, the United States of America has had also influence in terms of Japan's economic policy. That kind of influence the United States does not have with respect to China. Secondly, I think China itself drew lessons from what happened to Japan. So if you look at the currency policy of China, it has in fact been quite flexible in terms of the exchange rate. While it has over a period of time, it has followed a policy of keeping its the value of the yuan at a lower range. But at the same time, whenever there has been quite a push from the United States of America, it has adopted a somewhat more flexible stand. So it has followed a policy of fending off too much pressure on that score. Also, I think what is perhaps very important is that China has emerged as during this last 40 years, has emerged as the world's largest trading power. It has become the second most important, economy in the world, and unlike Japan, it has also become a second-ranking military power in the world. So, in terms of various levers of national power, perhaps one could say that China is much more of a comprehensive, power than Japan was able to become. So Japan had the economic pillar, but in terms of its international influence, and certainly in terms of its military power, it certainly did not have that. So China has that kind of a more comprehensive national power, which Japan did not have. Now, the one other thing I would like to draw attention to is with regard to the drivers of Chinese growth. I would like to just mention to you that a couple of years ago, a few years ago, I had been in China, and one of the former presidents of the Chinese Development Bank had given us a kind of a private briefing on if Japan, South Korea, other East Asian tigers were able to maintain a 10% rate of growth, say for 10 years or 15 years, how is it that China was able to maintain a longer span of high growth? And in fact, in terms of the rate of growth, he said we had a margin of 2% more. That is, we grew at a somewhat faster rate than the East Asian economies, and our high growth phase lasted somewhat longer. And what was the reason why this happened? So the 3 points that he mentioned was, one, that in China, even though the economic liberalization and reform took place, but land remained a property of the state. So the state's control over land was never given up. And this is the reason why a large number of the local governments who really have been behind the infrastructure push that you see in China, that these local governments were able to, by leasing out land, by selling land to developers and to industry, were able to raise large amount of money, large amount of capital, which were then able to put into infrastructure development. Some of it wasteful, of course, because you've seen there were empty cities that had been also created, or commercial space which was lying vacant. But by and large, much of the infrastructure, very tremendous infrastructure development which has taken place in China, a large part of it was financed by these land leases or land sales. So that was one important aspect. The second thing he pointed out was that the foreign capital which flowed into China, it was not so much from Western countries and Japan as it was from what he calls Greater China. That is, large part of the capital inflows took place from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, and also overseas Chinese communities in various countries. So large amount of the capital which was invested in China came from these constituencies. And that made a very big difference. That was the additionality which they got to the foreign investment or foreign capital as normally defined. The third element which he pointed out was, what was the importance of, for example, Deng Xiaoping's policy of, remaining under the radar, not playing a very prominent role, having a reasonably benign relationship with the West, was because the West was important not so much for capital but for technology. That they were able to pursue a foreign policy and an economic policy which enabled them to actually get large infusions of modern technology from these countries. And in that context, he also pointed out that China followed a very conscious policy of sending its brightest students to the best universities all across the world, because it recognized that ultimately the biggest resource was brain power, human resource. So the last point he made was that even if there is a setback to China because of geopolitical reasons, or because relations with the West become very adverse, that brain power will still be there, which will enable China to overcome. Even if there are setbacks, China can overcome those setbacks. So this, I thought, is a perspective which perhaps is very, very worthwhile looking at. The as far as the strategy that you talked about, for some, let me put it in this context. The policy of what Deng Xiaoping said, bide your time, hide your capabilities, don't take a leading role, this particular policy was pursued up to the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, where there was a consciousness that China was behind the West, particularly the United States. What 2007-2008 did was that the Chinese perception of and Chinese reading of the balance of power between China and the United States, that particular perception changed. So US was being seen now as a dysfunctional economy. So you had this famous Wang Qishan, the economic czar at that time, telling Hank Paulson that we thought you were our teachers, but now you are in the teacher's domain. It is we who should be teaching you how to run your affairs. So that change in perception also is important. That the West really no longer has much to teach us, that our brand of state capitalism is a much more efficient way of managing the economy. And that this has proved to be crisis ridden. So from then on, what you see is the Chinese way in which they talk about their foreign policy starts changing. And what they begin to say is that the balance of power is changing, that this has become a period of strategic opportunity for China, which opportunity should be leveraged by China by taking a much more activist position. So instead of the lie low policy, now you take a much more active and play a much more active role in global affairs. So from that, you see more recently what Xi Jinping has been saying is that the world is in the midst of changes which have not been seen for a century. There is great change, transformation taking place in the world. And more importantly, the balance of power has changed irreversibly. That means the United States of America and the West are in terminal decline. They can no longer, come back again. And therefore, this is an opportunity for China to move towards the center of world affairs. So this is, in terms of strategy, this is the strategy which is being put forward. That we must leverage this period of opportunity and relative weakness of the existing powers to really expand China's influence and China's space. Now, has that changed in the most recent past? Maybe some shift is taking place. Why? Because both Russia as well as China had this convergent view that, as I said, the West is in terminal decline. Also, the judgment that even if the United States of America continues to be the most formidable military power in the world, it has lost its will to fight. And the images of American withdrawal from Afghanistan seem to have convinced both Russia as well as China that the United States of America was no longer a credible adversary for China and Russia. So that is why you see February this year, the very interesting joint statement which talked about no limits partnership, no area of cooperation which was close to the two countries. And certainly, I think as far as Ukraine is concerned, the Chinese also accepted the Russian argument that this will be over in a few days. And it will be a fait accompli which the West will have to accept, as it had done Crimea, for example, in 2014. Now, and also that the Western European countries are completely divided. You have had Brexit, you have, all kinds of tensions amongst different West European countries. And as far as West Germany, the most important power is concerned, it is heavily dependent upon Russia itself for its energy supplies. So there was a sense that even if we do this, there will not be much of a credible, response from the West. That has proved to be wrong. Now, the calculations with respect to Ukraine did not quite work out. The West has at least temporarily come together again. The United States of America has bounced back in a sense and is playing a very active role in this conflict. Therefore, there is at least some room for reassessing the situation. And so if you look at the recent summit between Biden and Xi Jinping, my reading of that is that both sides have, in a sense, stepped back a little bit from open confrontation. And much of the language during the party congress was not saying that this is no longer a period of strategic opportunity, but all the time saying that we are in a much more challenging, much more threatening phase. That you must be prepared for struggle, because there will be storms, there will be, high waves, which we will have to navigate. This language is a little different from what it was before. So maybe some reassessment is taking place. So now in that context, what does it mean for India? Now, when I mentioned that 2007, 2008, the global financial and economic crisis, in a sense, brought about a change in the power equation between China and the US. That China was able to bounce back from that crisis and resume a somewhat higher rate of growth, maybe 6% or so after the global financial economic crisis. But the US and Western Europe, recovery was slow and recovery was rather weak. Therefore, there was a sense that the asymmetry of power between China and the West, and particularly the United States, this asymmetry of power is moving in favor of China. What, what about India? So, during the time that I was Foreign Secretary, if you see the trajectory of the Indian economy from, say, to the early 2000s to, say, the economic and financial crisis, during these 5 or 7 years, India's growth rate was getting accelerated. India was growing some years at the rate of 8%, 9% per annum. Even though it was behind China, it was being seen as this large emerging economy which is shrinking the gap with China. The discourse at that time was India is perhaps going to be the next China, the next big economic and commercial opportunity. This is the time when the whole concept of BRICS came up, if you remember, that these are the emerging economies. The future, in fact, is going to belong to them. India was behind China, but was seen in the same league as China, in that category of, large emerging economies. And therefore, the Chinese policy towards India was very much influenced by this perception. So in 2005, India and China perhaps reached what was the most positive phase in their relationship, where China began to say that there are a number of global issues on which India and China have similar views. Like, for example, on the global trading order, how it should be adjusted, the climate change regime, how that we have to safeguard our interests as large emerging economies. I myself, as chief negotiator on climate change, I used to work very closely with my Chinese counterpart. With regard to newer domains like cyber security or space security or space assets, that we have also common interests there. If we are able to work together, we can get a better deal for ourselves in these newer areas. So if those are the big things that India and China can do together, then it is in that kind of a spirit we should try and resolve the border issue, so that it is no longer sort of, a negative legacy from the past. Now, we all know that that particular phase came to an end by 2007, 2008. China's growth rate continued to rise higher than what it had been perhaps anticipated. India's growth rate came down. The asymmetry of power between India and China therefore started expanding, precisely at a time when the asymmetry of power between China and the US started shrinking. And that brought about a big change in the power equations, in the whole geopolitical equation. Therefore, the change of attitude towards India, that you are no longer in the same league as we are. You should understand your junior position. You should, in a sense, align with our policies. You should not take positions which China considers to be negative. So the whole concept of, for example, the Quad, or what India may even be doing in the neighboring countries, or India even taking action to improve its border infrastructure, which has been so far behind China. What Dr. Virmani mentioned, I did several border infrastructure surveys, and I can testify to the fact how far behind we have been. We have been making a lot of progress in the recent past, but that was also very asymmetrical. So there was this sense we don't really need to be very sensitive to Indian concerns because we are so far ahead. So this change in geopolitical situation, the geopolitical equations, explains a great deal why China has taken a much more assertive position and is not ready to make even today, not ready to make even the kind of limited gestures to India in order to bring the relation back to even key. They are ready to go back to what relations were, but by not making any kind of concessions themselves. So this is really the kind of a situation that we are facing. And with regard to population, let me just mention that yes, China is very conscious of the fact of the negative consequences of the one-child policy which they followed. Population not only has stopped growing in China, population in China is declining, which also means that with regard to the unproductive population in the higher age groups, that proportion is increasing. That means there is a smaller proportion of productive labor force which has to support this much larger unproductive or retired labor force. So this is something which China is conscious of, but can they reverse this? I think the if you look at historical experience, no country has been able to reverse this. Despite even the Japanese had made very big effort to try and persuade their families to have more children by offering, subsidies and by financing childcare, but it did not work because this is almost linked to the whole aspect of, rising living standards, rising incomes. They inevitably lead to smaller families. So even if there's going to be a heavy investment by China to try and reverse this, my view is it is not going to happen. So China is now going to face this population decline, and for that structural reason too, the ability to maintain a high growth rate will also be impacted. That is something which we have to. Now, India, of course, is population is still growing, but a growing population and a younger cohort is an asset only if you can gainfully employ them, which we have not been able to do. So unless you are able to find opportunities, gainful employment opportunities for this younger cohort, you are able to skill them, you are able to educate them. Merely by having a younger cohort is not an asset. In fact, it can, instead of being what they call a demographic dividend, it might become a demographic disaster as well. So even if India continues to grow, I do not consider that to be necessarily a positive factor unless we address these other issues as well, of education, of skilling, of providing employment opportunities. So I think I have covered most of the questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are running out of time, but General Sudhakar has been waiting patiently.
Yeah,
so please be brief, but I mean, you deserve go ahead. We can't hear you.
Muted.
Yeah, you are mute. Major General, you are mute.
Good evening, Chair sir. Very, very thankful to you for having given me an opportunity. I take this opportunity to congratulate the ambassador. One has had a number of opportunities to listen to Mr. Shyam Saran in the past. But in the past, the stimulating talk which the ambassador gave today, is actually speaking, it has cut so many previous records, like one of the gentlemen who asked a question. Must compliment him, sir. Sir, I come straight to the question to save time. I was inspired by your talk to frame my questions related to geopolitics and the global order. However, the ambassador has responded to them in a very comprehensive manner. To start with, what I had in the mind was that if we go as per the PPP terms, there are four topmost countries as far as the GDP is concerned today in the world. One is USA, second is China, third is Japan, and fourth is India. So out of four countries, here are three countries, well taken that it is the century of the Asia. But what it actually takes me is to a simplistic question to the ambassador, what lies ahead? When I say what lies ahead between China and America, one, which you have responded more than adequately, sir. between India and China. I'll come to the specific and the China per se. That is what is worrying me as a soldier, as a veteran. I'll come to the specifics, sir. First and foremost point, Ambassador has already responded. China's declining TFR, increasing aging population. As on today, it is 38.4. In some documents I saw, it has gone up to 39.6. And people say in next foreseeable future, it will cross 40. Reducing workforce. I know Ambassador has painted a picture of fait accompli before the China, but is there any way China is able to cope up? One, sir. Second, the manifestation of China's shift from fighting to win wars to winning local war along the Indo-China border and the Indian Ocean region. How is it going to manifest with the latest concept which has been outlined by Xi Jinping, sir? Third and the last point is that the impact of China's economy due to imposition of Chip Act by USA. May I have your comments, please, sir?
Thank you very much, General. With respect to some of the structural factors which are going to slow down China's economic growth, population is certainly one of them, but also most mature economies, productivity declines unless there is a technological sort of progress which counteracts that productivity decline. And that is the reason why China conscious.
Mr. Naziruddin, please mute yourself. Dr. Naziruddin.
If we look at the Chinese strategy outlined at the recent Congress, I quoted Xi Jinping saying that technology is going to be the main battlefield of the future. That technology is going to determine whether or not a country like China can maintain its fairly rapid, if not rapid, at least some positive rate of growth, because only technology can address the issue of declining productivity. Now, in that context, China has invested large amounts of resources in R&D. It is the second largest R&D power in the world today in terms of proportion of GDP which is devoted to R&D. Now, how much of that is actually producing innovation? How much of that is actually producing these kind of technological breakthrough? At the moment, some areas yes, some areas no. So if you take, for example, their space program, it has actually been remarkable progress that we have seen in the last few years. And that progress has its own kind of spin-offs with respect to other areas of the economy. On semiconductors, they are behind. By the way, China imports something like $450 billion worth of semiconductors from the rest of the world. It is a bigger import than Chinese oil imports. So you can imagine how critical this particular sector is. Therefore, there has been a very major negative impact on China as a result of the decision taken by the United States to prevent Chinese access to higher end semiconductors, much more importantly, the machines which make those high end semiconductors. Because the United States of America is still number one in terms of those very sophisticated machines which make those semiconductors. So access to that machinery and that technology has now been interrupted. And so the Chinese do recognize that this is going to be a very major setback in terms of their own economic growth. But they are also ready to put in huge sums of money to try and, as I said, achieve some degree of technological self-reliance. So I would not underestimate Chinese ability to be able to overcome some of these challenges, because we have seen that some other areas, they have not done too badly. So as I mentioned, the space program, for example, they are making I'm told, quite considerable progress in a new area like quantum computing, which will be a huge game changer if it actually becomes something that can have commercial applications. So that we have to wait and see how how this develops. But with respect to the what you mentioned about in PPP terms, what the relationship between these 4 5 powers is. PPP terms is good as far as it goes, but I think we should not pay too much or lay too much stress on it, as if this somehow is. You can put aside the nominal growth in GDP. Ultimately, as far as the relationship amongst countries are concerned, the nominal GDP is going to be the most important element. Whatever it may be as far as your domestic economy is concerned, because you are trading with others in terms of capital flows, it is the nominal rate which applies. So I would not exaggerate the importance of India's large GDP in PPP terms. It is important, but not is not that important in terms of its relationship with other countries. But having said that, if the Chinese economy is on now a slower growth path, if India is able to get back to a accelerated growth path again, which I believe the Indian economy is certainly capable of. Of course, I'm not an economist in the same caliber as Dr. Virmani, but I certainly believe that the potential of the Indian economy to have several more years of high growth is there, provided the right kind of policies are pursued. So if India is able to get back to, say, a growth trajectory of 8 or 9% per annum for the next 10 years or 20 years, the correlation between India and China will dramatically change. Even if we are still behind, but if we are seen as closing that gap, it will make a huge difference in terms of Chinese perceptions of India and in terms of international perceptions of India. And I draw that conclusion from my own experience in the period where I was Foreign Secretary, where we actually had that period of very high growth. Our diplomatic options expanded. We would not have been able to get the Indo-US nuclear deal today. We were able to get it at that time because of the fact that we were seen as as a very successful emerging economy. So I think in terms of how do we deal with this new China, a very assertive China, which takes for granted that it is the #1 power, at least in Asia, if not globally, and that other Asian countries must defer to China, which India is not prepared to do. How do we deal with that? So as a foreign policy person, I would say we normally talk about external balancing and domestic balancing. External balancing is that you come together with those countries who share our concerns about an assertive or an expanding China, which is precisely what we have done in our relationship with the US, Japan, Australia, trying to build up our relationship with some of the important countries in Southeast Asia, try to see how we can together provide a countervailing kind of a constraint on China's ambitions. And the second is, more importantly, is domestic balancing, which means what? Domestic balancing is that there is no alternative but to build up your own power in terms of economic capabilities, in terms of military capabilities, in terms of technological capabilities. You have to put your head down and really address this. And this is why I go back to what I said earlier to Dr. Virmani, that my view is, not being a professional economist, but my view is that Indian economy is fully capable of getting back to that accelerated growth path. That all the building blocks are there. It's a question of how do we bring them together. If we are able to do that, then of course we would be a much more credible countervailing power. Our credibility with in relation to countries in Asia, for example, will significantly increase. So that is really the answer, to the China challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, we are running out of time, and there's Mr. Sagar who had wanted, but I'm afraid I'll have to conclude it because I have to go for another meeting. But let me just say, emphasize one thing, very important point on economics, which Ambassador made, and that is actually a sustained increase in growth rate. If it fluctuates, people don't believe it.
No.
But if there is a sustained increase where they can see the catch up, with China, that makes a difference in perceptions and then in actions also. I think that's a very important point which many forget when they keep looking at the current gap or the past gap and so on. Yes, so that's very correct. With that, we could go on for another half an hour, but I'm sorry, it's been fascinating. So let me conclude the session and hand it to Charan to conclude the meeting.
Thank you.
Ambassador Saran and Dr. Virmani, I must thank both of you. As it took the shape of interaction, it really enriched. I must also thank the board member, Dr. Vishandas, and Major General Sudhakarji for contributing it. Ambassador, the way you've spoken today, and the way, despite we being in public policy for so many decades, the way you spoke today, the perspective of the government as a foreign expert is so apparent and clear. My submission to you, sir, would be, if you would agree, EGROW has so many experts, geopolitical experts, foreign experts, and of course, experts like you who are willing to speak to us. If we could partner with you and at least once in 2 months at IIC do such events. I think we have learned a lot from you today. And though we have been reading your work, we have been interacting, but the way you clarified some of the doubts that we had in our mind was so beautiful. So we have a foreign expert, a military expert, and an economist, and we could enrich the discussion. I'm sure your audience at IIC would really love it. Just a thought. And of course, I must thank you for your time and your excellent articulation, and I would say uninhibited articulation of various things.
Thank you.
I'm happy to announce that Ambassador's talk has been so scintillating. It'll be available on our website tomorrow around noon. You're free to use it. I'm sure many of us are going to re-listen the whole thing and get the feel of it. Next Friday, we have Professor from Sydney University, Babon Salvatore, speak to us about international indices on India. And me and Babon Salvatore have been talking, and me and Dr. Virmani for 10 years have been writing against the global hunger index. And now India seems to recognize that, well, we need to keep these forces at bay. A simple PhD degree by a young man then starts a new concept which is not even properly taking into account everything. So Professor Salvatore will be speaking about the international indices, and I would invite all of you to please come and participate in this. I can simply say Salvatore has been quite popular in India, though we had fixed an appointment about 2 months back. India Today did a seminar about a fortnight back, but we have searching questions for Professor Salvatore. So I would welcome all of you. Next Friday, I'll send you the exact times because he's in Sydney. We'll consult him and we'll send you the exact time. It'll be a little different from 4 to 5. Once again, let me thank all of you, especially our chair of the session and the speaker for having spent time and discussed this very vast issue with all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.